A splinter of wood could ransom a king and build a cathedral. These are the heirlooms of the Crusades, sacred relics whose journeys across continents and centuries tell a story far grander than any single battle. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these objects shaped empires and why their power endures today. We will uncover how a crown of thorns traveled from ancient Constantinople to the heart of Paris, and why armies fought over slivers of a cross. What object from the past holds the most captivating story for you? That pilgrim's arduous journey was fueled by a belief that heaven could be touched. In an age before mass printing or widespread literacy, faith was a deeply physical experience. Sacred relics were not just symbolic keepsakes. They were considered conduits of divine power, physical objects imbued with a holy presence that could intercede with God. These were the bones of a saint, a thread from the Virgin Mary's veil, or a tiny fragment of the cross upon which Jesus was crucified. To stand before such an object was to stand at the very threshold of the divine, an encounter that could cleanse sins, heal the sick, and secure a place in paradise. This belief created a spiritual economy of immense power and scale. A cathedral possessing a major relic became a destination for thousands of pilgrims, their donations fueling the construction of monumental buildings and enriching entire cities. Rulers and bishops competed fiercely to acquire these holy objects, for to possess a powerful relic was to hold a tangible claim to God's favor, legitimizing their authority and offering protection to their people. This was the driving force behind the Great Relic Hunt. When Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in France in the year 1095 and called for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land from its Muslim rulers, he was not just calling for a military campaign. He was inviting knights and commoners alike to seize the ultimate source of this spiritual currency, to lay their hands on the very ground where Christ walked, and to reclaim its most sacred treasures. The promise was not just land, but a direct line to the divine. The air was electric in the field outside Clermont. Pope Urban II did not simply ask for soldiers. He offered a divine bargain. He spoke of a land flowing with milk and honey, but more importantly, a land saturated with holy power. He told the knights of Europe they could trade their violent lives for eternal glory, promising full forgiveness for all their sins if they took up the cross. And he whispered of the ultimate prize, the very earthly treasures that would make that forgiveness tangible. The East, he suggested, was a vast treasury of sacred heirlooms waiting to be reclaimed by the faithful. This was not just a war for a city, it was a holy heist. The response was volcanic. Tens of thousands, from great lords to common peasants, sewed crosses onto their tunics and surged eastward, driven by a mixture of piety, ambition, and an unshakable belief in the physical reality of salvation. When the armies of the First Crusade against all odds actually succeeded, capturing Jerusalem in a brutal siege, they did more than just claim a city. They unlocked a sacred vault. The newly established Crusader states, these fragile European kingdoms on the edge of the Muslim world, suddenly became the new guardians of Christianity's most ancient sites. And with that guardianship came access to the relics themselves. The initial trickle of sacred objects became a torrent. Knights and bishops, now in control of churches that had housed these treasures for centuries, began sending them back to Europe as proof of their victory and to sanctify their home institutions. But how do you actually acquire a piece of the true cross or the bones of a prophet? The methods were as varied as the motives. Some relics were taken as outright plunder, the spoils of a conquered city. Others were given as diplomatic gifts from local Christian rulers seeking favor with their new Latin overlords. Many were simply purchased, with wealthy abbots in the West funding expeditions whose sole purpose was to negotiate for and acquire these holy commodities. The journey of these objects from east to west had begun, a centuries-long process of translocation that would reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe. The chaos within Jerusalem's shattered walls was a frenzy of devotion and greed. Amidst the terrible violence, knights clad in the cross did not just hunt for coin or jewels. Their most sought-after prizes were the sacred objects housed in the city's ancient shrines. They broke into churches, both those held by Eastern Christians and those converted into mosques, convinced they were liberating holy treasures from unbelievers. This was not mere plunder in their eyes. It was a sacred duty, a restoration of Christian property to Christian hands. The discovery of relics became a powerful narrative tool in the aftermath. A piece of the true cross was said to be found, or perhaps the holy lance that pierced Christ's side. Whether these were genuine finds, clever forgeries, or simply fervent inventions mattered less than their immediate utility. They served as divine proof, a sign from God that the horrific bloodshed had been justified and blessed. Chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres wrote of these events not with shame, but with reverent awe, describing the pious seizure of these objects as the Crusades' highest achievement. The most powerful of these relics were quickly packaged and sent on the long journey back to Europe. Their arrival was a sensation. When a fragment of the true cross reached a monastery in France or a splinter of the Holy Lance was delivered to a cathedral in Germany, it was tangible, irrefutable evidence of victory 1,000 miles away. It validated the enormous expense for the nobles who had funded the expeditions and served as the ultimate recruitment tool, inspiring a new generation to take the cross. Yet this direct and violent appropriation was only one method. For every relic taken by force, another was acquired through the quiet and calculating art of the gift. A single thorn set in a golden reliquary could buy an army. This was the quiet power of the diplomatic gift. While some relics were seized in the chaos of conquest, others traveled west through carefully orchestrated acts of political theater. An emperor in Constantinople, his empire threatened by powerful neighbors, would dispatch envoys to kings and popes in Europe. Their chests did not hold only letters or gold. They carried fragments of saints, pieces of the true cross, or thorns from the sacred crown, each one a tangible plea for military support. The message was clear. Help us defend Christendom, and you will receive a piece of its very heart. This was not looting. It was a high-stakes exchange where spiritual currency was traded for earthly swords and shields. The establishment of the Latin Empire after the Fourth Crusade turned this trickle into a flood. The new Western rulers, perched uneasily in the ancient capital of Byzantium, found themselves in control of the greatest collection of holy objects in the Christian world, but lacking the legitimacy to hold it. Their solution was to give it away. They sent relics across the sea to their feudal overlords and to powerful monasteries, buying political loyalty and sanctifying their own fragile rule with every sacred fragment they distributed. The arrival of such a gift was a spectacle designed for maximum impact. A reliquary containing a saint's finger bone would be met at the city gates by a procession of bishops, knights, and chanting monks. The entire town would turn out, witnessing the slow, solemn march as their new spiritual protector was carried to the cathedral. A chapel would be consecrated or even built anew just to house this single object, transforming a local church into a major pilgrimage site overnight. The bond forged by this transaction was not merely political. It was a sacred alliance, a fusion of spiritual and worldly power that rewrote the map of faith, one gifted relic at a time. But securing these treasures was only the first challenge. The real test was creating a home worthy of their divine power. Think of the sheer fragility of a piece of ancient wood or a sliver of bone embarking on a voyage across 1,000 miles of open sea. The journey of a relic from a church in Jerusalem to a cathedral in Paris was an epic in itself, a logistical nightmare wrapped in profound faith. These were not sturdy trade goods. A saint's skeletal hand or a faded textile believed to be from the robe of Christ required a level of care that rivaled the protection given to any king. Before they ever saw a ship, these objects were sealed inside their first line of defense, the reliquary. These were not simple boxes. They were miniature architectural wonders crafted from gold, silver, and precious gems, designed to be both a fortress and a throne. The casket itself became a sacred object, its beauty reflecting the immense value of the treasure it held within, protecting the relic from the physical dangers of travel and from any perceived disrespect. The voyage across the Mediterranean was a gauntlet of perils. Ships of the era were small and vulnerable, at the mercy of sudden storms that could shatter their timbers. Pirates hunted the sea lanes, and the threat of capture or shipwreck was constant. The captains and knights tasked with this sacred cargo knew they carried not just a valuable object, but a piece of divine power. Their journey was a pilgrimage of protection. Chroniclers like William of Tyre documented the precise rituals that governed these transports. The relic might be kept in the ship's small chapel, with prayers offered daily for safe passage. Its handlers were chosen for their piety and reliability, their mission considered a direct service to God. The successful arrival of such a ship in a port like Venice or Marseille was an event that stopped the entire city. Bells would ring out from every church tower. The bishop, leading a procession of all the local clergy, noblemen, and guilds, would march to the docks to formally receive the holy guest. The relic was then carried through streets strewn with flowers, with crowds reaching out, not to touch the casket itself, but to simply be near the divine presence it carried. This triumphant parade was far more than a celebration. It was a powerful public ritual that transferred spiritual authority from the distant Holy Land directly to the heart of a European city, permanently elevating its status. Yet for all this public spectacle, a quiet and critical question always remained. How could anyone be certain that the object inside that magnificent golden casket was genuine? After such an arduous journey, the most important task began, the work of proving that this newfound treasure was truly a conduit to the divine and not merely an elaborate forgery. A single bishop's signature on a scrap of parchment could transform a piece of old bone into a sacred treasure. In the medieval world, authenticating a relic was an art form built on a fragile foundation of human testimony and perceived divine favor. Without carbon dating or chemical analysis, proof was a matter of documentation and declared miracle. The most valuable relics came with a pedigree, a chain of custody known as provenance. This was often a written certificate from a bishop or abbot, attesting that the object had been obtained from a reputable source in the Holy Land, perhaps even accompanied by a sworn oath from a knight who claimed to have been present at its discovery. Yet the most powerful form of authentication was not a document but an event. A reported miracle occurring in the presence of the relic was considered the ultimate seal of divine approval. If a blind person claimed to see or a lame person walked after praying before the object, its power was deemed incontrovertible. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of belief, where faith in the relic's power generated the very phenomena that were used to prove it. But not everyone was convinced. The potential for deception was enormous, and some voices of reason cut through the fervor. The 12th century scholar Guibert of Nogent wrote scathing critiques of relic collections, pointing out the obvious absurdity of multiple churches claiming to possess the entire head of John the Baptist. He argued that the veneration of objects without verified histories was a form of superstition that corrupted true faith. His skepticism highlights a vibrant and surprisingly public debate happening even at the height of relic veneration. Theologians wrestled with a profound question. Was the power of a relic inherent within the object itself, a tangible fragment of holiness, or did its power flow solely from the faith of the believer who knelt before it? If a relic was later proven to be a forgery, were the miracles it had performed also fake? These were not just academic exercises. The market for relics was so incredibly lucrative that forgery became a sophisticated industry. Workshops produced everything from ancient-looking boxes to fake papal seals, while storytellers crafted elaborate legends to explain how a saint's entire body had made its way from the Middle East to a small town in France. This shadow economy of sacred objects forces us to see these heirlooms not just as articles of faith, but as products of a complex economy where belief and deception were often intertwined. This inherent uncertainty does not diminish their historical power. If anything, it deepens the mystery surrounding every golden reliquary. The most enduring relics, like the crown of thorns, survived not because they were ever scientifically proven, but because their stories were so compelling they became true in their consequences, shaping the destinies of kings and cities for centuries to come. The crown of thorns was more than an object of devotion. It was a financial instrument of last resort. For centuries, it had resided in the great imperial chapel of Constantinople, a glittering symbol of Byzantine divine right. But by the 1230s, the Latin Empire established by the Fourth Crusade was teetering on the brink of collapse, its treasury empty. The Emperor, Baldwin II, was desperate for funds to pay his soldiers and shore up his crumbling walls. He looked at the most valuable asset in his possession, the very crown believed to have been pressed onto the head of Christ, and he made a pragmatic, shocking decision. He pawned it. The relic was handed over to Venetian merchants in Constantinople as collateral for a massive loan, transforming a sacred heirloom into a line of credit. This act reveals the dual nature of these objects, existing simultaneously in the realm of pure faith and hard, cold cash. News of this transaction reached the deeply pious King Louis IX of France. He saw not a pawned item, but a spiritual emergency. Here was the most significant relic of Christ's passion, held by bankers. Louis immediately paid off Baldwin's enormous debt to the Venetians, effectively purchasing the crown of thorns for a sum so vast it nearly emptied the French royal coffers. The price was not just monetary, it was a profound investment in spiritual and political capital. In 1239, the relic arrived in France. Its reception was a national event. King Louis, barefoot and dressed in a simple tunic, personally carried the reliquary into Paris, transforming its arrival into a powerful piece of political theater that humbled a king before a higher power. But Louis did not simply store this new treasure in an existing cathedral. He commissioned a building that would itself become a reliquary of unparalleled beauty, the Sainte-Chapelle. Constructed in the heart of his palace in Paris, this chapel is a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, a cage of light made from towering stained glass windows. Its entire purpose was to house the crown of thorns and other passion relics, creating a new Jerusalem in the center of his capital. The Sainte-Chapelle was Louis's bold declaration that the spiritual center of gravity had shifted. The holy city was no longer just a distant place in the east to be conquered. It was now a presence you could encounter in Paris. The chapel became an instant pilgrimage destination, drawing the faithful from across Europe and solidifying the French monarchy's image as the most devout in Christendom. This single relic's journey from a pawn shop in Constantinople to a jewel box chapel in Paris perfectly encapsulates the entire era, a story where faith, finance, and royal ambition were inextricably woven together. Yet for every relic that found a permanent home like Sainte-Chapelle, countless others were destined for far more turbulent futures. The sheer volume of surviving wood claimed to be from the true cross presents a puzzle that has amused skeptics for centuries. A 16th-century reformer named John Calvin once quipped that if all the documented fragments were gathered, they would build a sizable ship, not a single cross. Yet this very abundance reveals a core mechanism of medieval faith, the principle of fragmentation. A large and important relic was not meant to be hoarded by a single institution. Instead, it was physically divided, broken into smaller and smaller pieces so that its sanctifying power could be spread far and wide. A sliver of wood no bigger than a fingernail, once part of a larger piece from Jerusalem, was considered just as holy, just as potent as the original beam. This was not seen as dilution, but as multiplication. The spiritual essence of the whole cross was believed to be fully present in even its tiniest fragment. This practice transformed the geography of devotion. A humble parish church in a remote village could now possess a tangible connection to the central event of Christianity. The arrival of such a fragment was a local revolution, placing that community on the spiritual map and giving its people a direct physical focus for their prayers. The reliquaries designed for these minute treasures were masterpieces of emphasis. A speck of wood would be mounted on a velvet pillow inside a crystal tube, then placed within an elaborate sculpture of silver and gold that might depict the crucifixion itself. The artistry of the container magnified the significance of the contents, directing awe toward the almost invisible splinter at its heart. This was the democratization of the divine, a way for countless ordinary people to access a holiness that once seemed locked away in distant holy lands. Alongside these fragmented pieces of wood, the bodily remains of saints formed another vast and deeply personal category of Crusader spoils, their journeys just as dramatic but far more intimate. The bones of a saint were more than sacred remains, they were a spiritual anchor for an entire community. The ceremonial act of moving these relics, known as a translation, was a breathtaking public drama. It was not a secret theft but a triumphant liberation, a narrative the Crusaders fervently embraced. They believed they were rescuing the physical bodies of holy men and women from lands they perceived as desecrated, granting them the honor and veneration they deserved in the Christian West. This powerful idea was demonstrated decades before the First Crusade in the daring translation of Saint Nicholas. In the year 1087, sailors from the Italian city of Bari sailed to the church in Myra, Asia Minor, which was then under Muslim control. They seized the saint's bones and brought them home to Bari. The arrival of Saint Nicholas transformed the city into one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Europe, a clear blueprint for the spiritual and economic rewards that such a sacred heist could bring. When a major saint's relics arrived in a new city, the public rituals were designed to be unforgettable. The bones, sealed within an ornate reliquary, were carried in a slow, solemn procession through streets hung with tapestries. The entire population would turn out, weeping, praying, and singing hymns. This was not just a parade, it was a test. The community watched for a sign, any small miracle that would prove the saint was pleased with their new home. A sudden break in the clouds, a healing, a fragrant scent emerging from the casket, all were interpreted as divine approval. These events created an unbreakable bond between the saint and the city, grounding the ancient stories of the faith in the very soil of France, Italy, or Germany. This physical connection to the early church was a source of immense local pride, but it was also the ignition for an economic revolution. A town that successfully acquired a famous saint's remains did not just gain a protector, it gained an industry. A saint's bones could build a cathedral from the ground up. This was the tangible power of the pilgrimage economy. A single major relic acted like a spiritual magnet, pulling a continuous stream of travelers from across Europe. Each pilgrim was a walking source of revenue. They needed a bed for the night, a meal, a new pair of shoes, and a leaden badge to prove they had completed their journey. This constant flow of people turned quiet towns into bustling economic hubs. Consider the city of Cologne, which acquired the reputed remains of the three magi. Overnight, it became one of the premier destinations in Christendom. The entire city reoriented itself to serve the pilgrimage trade, with inns, taverns, and workshops sprouting along the routes leading to its magnificent cathedral. The funds generated from these visitors were so immense they directly financed the construction of the very building designed to house the relics that drew them there. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of devotion and development. This financial reality elevated relics from objects of faith into instruments of high finance. A king facing a costly war did not just pray for victory. He might go to a monastery and borrow money, using a sacred relic as his collateral. The abbot, trusting in both the king's promise and the saint's power, would provide the funds, secure in the knowledge that the object was a guarantee beyond any piece of land or title. Before a crucial battle, that same relic would be paraded before the army, a physical reminder that God himself had a stake in the outcome. A victory was then publicly attributed to the relic's intervention, a story that would be told and retold, further enhancing its fame and drawing even more pilgrims and their wealth in the future. This fusion of faith and finance created an intensely competitive market. Bishops and abbots vied with each other to acquire the most powerful relics, knowing that spiritual prestige translated directly into economic and political influence. The architectural marvels of the Middle Ages, the soaring cathedrals and jewel-box chapels, were not just acts of pure devotion. They were strategic investments, built to house a spiritual commodity that promised both salvation and solvency. Yet this immense value also cast a dark shadow, making these sacred heirlooms the most coveted prizes for the most desperate of men. A saint could be stolen, and the theft itself was considered a holy miracle. This paradoxical idea lies at the heart of a widespread practice known as pious theft, or fur to sacra. In an age where a saint's physical presence brought divine favor and economic prosperity, the line between devout transfer and outright robbery was often blurred. A group of monks might sneak into a rival monastery, break open the altar, and steal the bones of its patron saint. They did not see themselves as criminals. They believed the saint, by allowing the theft to succeed, was actively choosing a new home and a new community of devotees. The successful theft was its own form of divine authentication, a miracle of mobility that proved the saint's will. This spiritual justification, however, easily masked more worldly ambitions. The same relics that were carried in pious processions could also be seized as the spoils of war, even in conflicts between Christian powers. The most devastating example was the Fourth Crusade Sack of Constantinople in the year 1204. Instead of sailing to reclaim Jerusalem, a Crusader army turned on the greatest Christian city in the world. For 3 days, they systematically looted its churches and monasteries, hauling away a treasure trove of relics that had been gathered over 1,000 years. The crown of thorns, pieces of the true cross, the skull of John the Baptist, and countless other sacred objects were packed onto ships bound for Venice, France, and Germany. This event was not a quiet pious theft. It was a catastrophic act of plunder that scattered the spiritual heritage of the Byzantine Empire across Western Europe, creating a wound in the relationship between the Eastern and Western churches that has never fully healed. The constant risk of such theft forced churches to become fortresses. Reliquaries evolved from beautiful containers into veritable safes, crafted with complex locks and hidden compartments. Chapels were built with thick walls, barred windows, and guarded doors. The very design of medieval churches, with their raised crypts and labyrinthine passages, was partly a response to the need to protect their most valuable assets from pious thieves and opportunistic soldiers alike. This shadow history forces us to confront a difficult truth. The lineage of many of Europe's most venerated relics is not a clean, holy chain of custody. It is a story punctuated by midnight raids, broken seals, and the clash of steel in church naves, a legacy of sacred heirlooms acquired through a mixture of fervent belief and outright violence. And just as this system of veneration reached its peak, a revolution in thought began to question its very foundations. A new kind of faith declared war on the old bones and splinters of wood. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century did not just challenge the authority of the Pope, it targeted the very physical foundation of medieval piety, the cult of relics. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin saw not holy conduits but idolatry. They asked a devastatingly simple question. If there is only one John the Baptist, how can three different cathedrals each claim to possess his authentic skull? The sheer volume of fraudulent relics provided them with an unanswerable argument against a system they believed had corrupted true Christianity. In their view, salvation came from faith and scripture alone, not from touching a piece of ancient wood or a saint's finger bone. This was a theological earthquake that reshaped the spiritual landscape of Europe. In towns and cities that embraced the new Protestant faith, the result was iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of religious images and objects. Mobs, sometimes led by preachers, stormed into cathedrals. They tore open golden reliquaries, not to venerate the contents, but to discard them. The bones of saints were thrown into rivers or buried in unconsecrated ground. The magnificent containers themselves, those masterworks of gold and gemstones, were melted down into coin or bullion, their artistic and spiritual value erased in the furnace. A great divide opened across the continent. Catholic strongholds like Spain, Italy, and southern Germany continued to parade their relics and build glorious new chapels for them. Meanwhile, in Protestant England, the Netherlands, and northern Germany, the physical traces of this centuries-old tradition were systematically purged from churches, leaving empty niches and stripped altars. This was more than a theological dispute. It was a battle over the nature of the sacred itself. Was holiness something you could locate in a specific place, contained within a physical object, or was it a matter of individual conscience and inward belief, utterly separate from the material world? The Reformation forced that question into the open, and for millions, the answer meant that the heirlooms of the Crusades were not treasures but lies. Yet the tradition was not so easily eradicated. In hidden crypts and behind false walls, faithful Catholics risked everything to safeguard their community's most precious relics from the Reformers' hammers. Many of the objects we can see today in European churches survived only because of these secret acts of preservation, a testament to a devotion that refused to let go of the physical touch of the divine. This great schism ensured the Crusader heirlooms would endure, but their world of unquestioning belief was gone forever. A new age of reason was dawning, one that would scrutinize these sacred objects with a very different kind of faith, the faith in science. The sacred bones that once inspired pilgrimages were now laid out on a scholar's desk for measurement and classification. The Age of Enlightenment did not destroy the heirlooms of the Crusades, but it did something perhaps more profound. It changed the very question people asked when they looked at them. The central question was no longer, what can this object do for my soul? Instead, the new question was, what can this object tell us about our past? The rationalist thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries saw the medieval veneration of relics not as pious devotion, but as a grand and prolonged episode of mass superstition. They applied the new tools of historical criticism and textual analysis to the legendary stories that surrounded these objects, and many of those stories simply fell apart. A scholar could now point to a document and demonstrate that a particular saint's arm had been recorded in 2 different countries at the same time, or that the historical record for a famous relic began suspiciously late, centuries after the saint's death. The object itself remained, but its aura of unquestioned divine power was dissolving. This intellectual shift had a tangible effect on where these treasures ended up. The magnificent reliquaries that had once been the centerpieces of cathedral altars found a new home in the private cabinets of curiosity owned by wealthy aristocrats and the early public museums that were just beginning to appear. In these new spaces, they were not displayed for prayer. They were exhibited as exquisite examples of the goldsmith's art, or as fascinating anthropological artifacts that revealed the strange beliefs of a bygone era. The object was the same, but its meaning had been completely remade. This process of secularization reached its violent climax during the French Revolution. In a wave of anti-clerical fury, the property of the church was declared the property of the nation. Revolutionary committees stormed into monasteries and cathedrals, seizing golden reliquaries and melting them down for coin to fund the new republic. The sacred contents, the bones and the wood, were often discarded as worthless rubbish. It was the lowest point in the long history of these sacred heirlooms, a moment when it seemed their story had reached a final, rationalist end. Yet, in a great historical irony, this very act of destruction and confiscation is what saved countless relics for the future. By transferring them from churches to state-owned museums and libraries, the revolutionaries, intending to break their spiritual power, accidentally became their preservers. They were no longer objects of active worship, but they were now officially catalogued and protected as historical artifacts of the French nation. Stripped of their divine authority, they gained a new identity as witnesses to history, a transformation that would set the stage for their most unexpected rebirth. The very same relics that the Enlightenment had dismissed as superstition were suddenly bathed in a new and flattering light, the glow of romantic nostalgia. The 19th century did not want to dissect the past, it wanted to feel it. A powerful cultural wave, the Romantic movement, turned away from cold reason and looked back with longing to the age of chivalry, to knights and sacred quests. In this reimagined Middle Ages, Crusader relics were not fraudulent bones. They were the noble spoils of a more heroic and spiritually authentic time. Writers like Sir Walter Scott crafted sweeping novels filled with gallant crusaders and holy grails, stories that captivated the public imagination and painted the entire era in tones of thrilling adventure and pious grandeur. This was not a return to medieval faith, but a new kind of secular devotion to the romance of history itself. Artists and architects joined this chorus, launching the Gothic revival. They rejected the clean lines of classicism, designing new churches, university buildings, and even train stations with the pointed arches and soaring spires of the medieval cathedrals they so admired. It was an architecture of emotion, designed to evoke a sense of awe and mystery, and what belonged in these new old buildings, the very heirlooms that had been gathering dust in storage. A profound shift occurred in the halls of cathedrals and churches across Europe. The reliquaries that had been hidden away to save them from revolution or ridicule were now carefully restored and triumphantly returned to public view. Their value, however, had subtly changed. They were still objects of religious respect, but they were now also cherished as trophies of a national epic, physical proof of a country's chivalrous and adventurous soul. This romantic impulse was not confined to Europe's libraries and galleries. It fueled a new and systematic curiosity about the lands of the Bible, giving birth to the era of Holy Land archaeology. Wealthy patrons and scholarly societies funded expeditions to Palestine, where teams began to dig, not for treasure but for verification. They sought to uncover the walls of Jericho, the tomb of David, or any artifact that could connect the romantic stories of Walter Scott to the actual soil of the Levant. While their methods were often crude by modern standards, they sometimes made stunning finds, unearthing Crusader castles, Byzantine churches, and coins that added new, tangible pieces to the historical puzzle. This romantic re-enchantment was a rescue operation for the Crusader heirlooms. It saved them from being forgotten as mere curiosities and reframed them as timeless symbols of mystery and human aspiration. By wrapping these objects in a new narrative of national heritage and romantic adventure, the 19th century guaranteed their survival, ensuring they would enter the 20th century not as discarded superstitions, but as cherished monuments to the past. Now, however, they would have to face their most rigorous test yet, not from reformers or revolutionaries, but from the quiet, objective gaze of the laboratory. The laboratory's quiet hum has replaced the chanting of pilgrims. In the 21st century, the interrogation of these sacred heirlooms continues, but the tools have changed from pious belief to radiocarbon dating and genetic sequencing. We can now ask a piece of the true cross a direct question: how old are you? And the wood can answer. Carbon-14 dating measures the steady decay of radioactive carbon in organic materials, providing a date range for when a tree was cut down. This technology has been applied to numerous relics with often startling results. A famous example is the study of the Shroud of Turin. While not a Crusader relic itself, its story is a perfect case study of this modern dynamic. Radiocarbon tests in the late 1980s dated the linen to the medieval period, specifically between 1260 and 1390. For scientists, this was a clear result. For many of the faithful, it was an irrelevance, a test on a later repair or a misunderstanding of the shroud's mysterious origins. The scientific data and the devotional narrative simply passed each other like ships in the night. This is the new frontier for Crusader relics. A bone fragment attributed to a 1st century saint might be carbon dated to the 3rd or 4th century. This does not mean the relic is a fake, far from it. It often confirms that the object is genuinely ancient and was venerated for centuries, but it disconnects it from its specific legendary origin. Science can tell us the age of the material, but it cannot measure the weight of 1,000 years of prayer. This creates a fascinating and often uncomfortable space where faith and evidence are forced into a dialogue. For a museum curator today, the responsibility is profound. How do you display a reliquary that once held the arm of St. George? The modern label must tell two stories side by side. One paragraph recounts the medieval tradition, the thrilling tale of how Crusaders brought this sacred arm back from the Holy Land. The next paragraph might calmly state that scientific analysis suggests the bones are from a woman who lived several centuries after the saint's martyrdom. The viewer is then invited into a conversation, asked to hold both truths in their mind simultaneously. The object becomes a prism, reflecting different kinds of light depending on your angle of view. Is it a holy relic? Is it a historical artifact? The answer is yes, it is both. This scientific lens does not close the book on these objects. It adds a new, complex, and deeply human chapter. We are no longer just tracing the journey of a splinter of wood from Jerusalem to Paris. We are tracing the evolution of human understanding itself, from an age of miracle and mystery to an age of analysis and evidence. And just as we learn to navigate this new terrain, the very nature of the journey is transforming once again, moving from the physical world into the boundless realm of the digital. A digital scan of the crown of thorns can now be studied in Tokyo or Toronto without a single pilgrim boarding a plane. We are witnessing the birth of a new kind of heirloom, one that exists not in a golden casket, but as pure information. The physical object remains behind its protective glass in Paris, but its exact likeness, captured through high-resolution laser scanning and photogrammetry, is set free into the world. Institutions like the Otchen Cathedral have undertaken this work with profound care, creating perfect three-dimensional digital models of their priceless reliquaries. You can zoom in, rotate them, and examine intricate details of the goldsmith's work that would be invisible to someone standing in the cathedral itself. This is more than simple photography. It is a form of preservation that guards against the ultimate tragedy of loss. If fire, war, or the slow decay of time were to ever claim the original, its precise digital twin would remain, a perfect seed from which its story could be endlessly retold. This virtual migration is creating a permanent and incorruptible lineage. Online databases and digital museums are assembling the scattered histories of these objects, linking scans of a relic with scans of its medieval travel documents, historical paintings that depict it, and scholarly articles that analyze it. For the first time, the entire fractured story of a Crusader heirloom can be reassembled in a single, accessible space. This digital provenance is a fortress against forgetfulness, ensuring that the complex journey of a sacred object from Jerusalem to its current home is mapped with a clarity that parchment records could never guarantee. The story itself becomes the primary relic, preserved with the durability of data. And just as these objects find new homes in virtual museums, they are also finding new congregations on social media. Online communities form around the shared fascination with a particular relic, with members from different continents and faiths exchanging historical facts, personal reflections, and images. A person might post a picture of a digital scan of St. Catherine's arm, and the comments will fill with stories of medieval miracles, links to academic papers, and personal accounts of how the image provided comfort. This is a new form of distributed veneration, not centered on a physical pilgrimage to a single site, but on a shared, global conversation. The power of the object is no longer confined to its immediate physical presence. It now flows through the network, touching people in ways the original Crusader knights could never have conceived. This incredible global accessibility, however, forces a difficult and urgent question into the open. If a digital copy of a sacred object can be experienced by anyone, anywhere, who truly owns its legacy, the very technology that preserves these heirlooms also ignites modern debates about cultural patrimony and repatriation. When a high-definition scan of a relic sits on a server in Europe, but the object itself was taken from a church in Constantinople during a brutal sack, the digital age gives a powerful new voice to old claims. Museums and cathedral treasuries that once saw themselves as the permanent guardians of a universal human heritage are now being asked to consider the complex histories of how these treasures were acquired. The digital replica does not erase the past. Instead, it often illuminates the shadows of that past with a stark new light, inviting a global audience to participate in a conversation about justice, history, and the rightful home for a culture's most sacred possessions. A golden reliquary in a Parisian museum is also a ghost from a looted church in Constantinople. This is the heart of a modern ethical storm, the debate over repatriation. The fundamental question is stark: who holds the true moral claim to these sacred heirlooms? Is it the nations and churches where they have been kept and venerated for centuries, or the original communities from which they were taken, often by force? There is no simple answer, only a tangle of powerful and deeply felt arguments. On one side, the call for return is a call for historical justice. For the Greek Orthodox Church, the Sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not a medieval political event, but a spiritual wound that has never healed. The request for the return of relics is not about property law. It is about healing that ancient trauma and restoring a broken spiritual lineage. It is an argument that asks us to see these objects not as neutral artifacts, but as the stolen soul of a community. The counter-argument speaks of a different kind of inheritance. The crown of thorns has been a central part of French national identity for nearly 800 years. It survived the French Revolution, it inspired the construction of one of the world's most beautiful chapels, and it is woven into the very fabric of Parisian history. To remove it, proponents argue, would be to sever a living cultural tradition, to impoverish one community in order to enrich another. They also point to practical fears. Would a relic be as safe, as studied, and as accessible to a global public if it were returned to a single religious institution? This debate forces a difficult reckoning with the Crusades themselves. The romantic image of the chivalrous knight is colliding with the historical reality of the holy heist, the pious theft on a colossal scale. We are being asked to decide if the passage of time sanctifies a possession, or if certain historical wrongs demand redress no matter how many centuries have passed. What does justice look like across a gap of 800 years? There is no court that can easily rule on this. Each case becomes a unique negotiation, a delicate balance between faith, culture, and the long shadow of history. The resolution of these disputes, whether through permanent return, long-term loan, or shared stewardship, will write the next chapter in these objects' astonishing biographies. And as institutions grapple with these weighty questions, the stories of these relics have escaped their glass cases to conquer an entirely new realm, the vibrant world of popular culture. The search for the Holy Grail is a blockbuster plot, but its roots run deep into the soil of medieval history. Modern storytellers have inherited the Crusaders' quest, transforming sacred heirlooms into the ultimate narrative prize. In films like Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, the Grail is not just a cup, it is a test of character and a source of immortality, echoing the medieval belief that a relic could grant eternal life. Video games like Assassin's Creed build entire worlds around these artifacts, allowing players to navigate digitally recreated Jerusalem or Constantinople in a virtual relic hunt. These are not history lessons, they are secularized adventures that nonetheless keep the core idea powerfully alive. The object containing world-altering power remains a compelling MacGuffin, a physical focal point for a grand adventure. This pop culture presence acts as a powerful filter, simplifying complex histories into clear narratives of good versus evil, of seekers and guardians. While a historian might wince at the inaccuracies, this cultural repackaging serves a vital purpose. It ensures that the basic concept of a Crusader relic, an object of immense power with a mysterious past, remains a recognizable archetype in our collective imagination. The very familiarity of this trope is a testament to its enduring grip on the human psyche. We are still captivated by the idea that touching a piece of the past could change everything. To see this legacy in its most concentrated form, we must travel to the specific places where history, faith, and treasure converge. Auchen Cathedral holds a treasure that was never meant to be seen. Inside its Palatine chapel, built by the Emperor Charlemagne himself, rests a collection of objects so sacred they are hidden from view for years at a time. This is not a museum display but a sacred trust, a concentration of spiritual power gathered to serve an empire. Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, was a master of political theater. He understood that to rule a vast and fractured continent, he needed more than armies and laws. He needed divine legitimacy. He actively collected relics believed to be the cloak of the Virgin Mary, the swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus, and the loincloth Christ wore on the cross. These were not just articles of faith. They were diplomatic tools, gifts from Byzantine emperors and the Patriarch of Jerusalem, meant to weave Charlemagne's new European empire directly into the fabric of the biblical story. He was building a new Rome, and its holiness needed to be tangible. Centuries later, the Crusades provided a new source for this sacred power. Later Holy Roman emperors, following Charlemagne's blueprint, enhanced the collection with relics brought back from the Holy Land, further cementing the idea that their empire was the true and direct heir to the ancient Christian world. The authority of an emperor could be measured in the threads of a saint's garment. This spiritual capital was managed with brilliant precision. The most powerful relics in Auchen were not left on permanent display. Instead, they were brought out for public veneration only once every 7 years in an event known as the Otchen Pilgrimage. This created a cycle of immense anticipation. For years, the objects would remain sealed away, their presence a whispered rumor. Then, as the 7th year approached, the entire continent seemed to turn its eyes toward Auchen. Pilgrims by the tens of thousands would descend upon the city, a river of humanity all flowing toward the cathedral doors. Can you envision the scene? The air thick with incense and the murmur of prayers in a dozen languages, the slow, solemn procession of bishops carrying the golden reliquaries, and finally, the moment when the caskets were opened and the crowd caught its first glimpse of the ancient cloth. This was more than a religious service. It was a masterclass in crowd management and spiritual economics. By creating scarcity, the Church amplified desire, ensuring that each pilgrimage was a monumental event that reinforced Auchen's status as a spiritual center for the entire empire. This 7-year rhythm has continued with astonishing resilience for centuries. It survived the theological doubts of the Reformation, when Protestant critics denounced such veneration as idolatry. It endured the rationalist scorn of the Enlightenment, which saw it as mere superstition. It even persisted through the upheavals of modern wars and secularism. The most recent pilgrimage in 2023 still drew massive crowds, a testament to the enduring human need for a physical connection to the sacred. Auchen is not a frozen monument. It is a living museum where the original purpose of these Crusader heirlooms, to legitimize power, to focus devotion, to draw a community together, is still performed, not just remembered. The very stones of the cathedral seem to hum with this continuous tradition, a rare thread of practice connecting the age of Charlemagne to our own. Yet for every collection like Auchen's, held in a continuous line of care, there are others whose stories are defined by fracture and loss. The great Palace of Constantinople once held a collection so vast it was said to mirror the wealth of heaven itself. Before the Fourth Crusade sack, the city was the unrivaled treasury of Christendom, its churches and palaces overflowing with the most sacred heirlooms of the faith. Imagine a single chapel housing the crown of thorns, the supposed skull of John the Baptist, the Holy Lance, and countless fragments of the true cross. This was not merely a collection. It was a spiritual fortress, its relics serving as the divine bedrock of the Byzantine Empire's authority. In the year 1204, that fortress was breached and its treasures were ripped from their altars. The organized looting that followed was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a systematic divvying up of sanctity. The Crusader army and their Venetian financiers treated the city's sacred wealth as a form of currency, dividing relics as calculated spoils to pay off debts and reward loyalties. The crown of thorns began its journey to Paris. The shroud of Constantinople, a cloth believed to have borne the imprint of Christ's face, was taken. A piece of the true cross was sent to the Vatican. A revered icon of the Virgin Mary was carried to a monastery in Kiev. In a single, violent event, the greatest concentration of Christian relics the world had ever known was shattered into 1,000 fragments and scattered across the map of Europe. Tracing any one of these objects today is a historian's greatest challenge. How do you follow the path of a splinter of wood from a church in Constantinople to a cathedral in Trier? The clues are fragmented, hidden in a handful of surviving chronicles, in cryptic entries in old treasury inventories, and in the very artistry of the reliquaries that were built to house them in the West. A golden casket in Venice might bear a distinct Byzantine enamel style, strongly suggesting it was crafted in a Constantinople workshop before being seized and repurposed. A bishop's letter might casually mention receiving a saint's arm from a returning knight, providing a rare, solid date for its arrival. Each piece of evidence is a breadcrumb on a trail that is 8 centuries cold. This massive dispersal was a foundational gain for countless Western churches and monasteries, which suddenly found their prestige immeasurably elevated by a newly acquired sacred heirloom. But for the Eastern Orthodox world, it was a cultural and spiritual catastrophe of incalculable scale. The physical heart of their faith had been carved out and carried away. The empty reliquaries left behind in Constantinople were silent witnesses to a rupture that has never fully healed. This history of profound loss forces a difficult question upon us. Does the survival of these objects in Western museums, as beautiful and historically valuable as they are, truly compensate for the broken lineage and the spiritual void their absence created? The story of Constantinople's treasures is a permanent lesson in the fragility of cultural heritage, a stark reminder that the same conflicts that create heirlooms can also shatter the world that gave them meaning. A dusty road in Spain could become a path to paradise. The physical relocation of sacred heirlooms did more than fill church treasuries. It actively rewrote the spiritual map of an entire continent. A town like Trier in Germany, which acquired the Holy Tunic, or Compostela in Spain with the tomb of St. James, did not just gain a precious object. They became power stations of divine grace, their local geography permanently altered by the presence of a holy fragment. Pilgrims no longer had to risk the long, dangerous, and expensive journey to a Jerusalem under Muslim control. They could now achieve a similar spiritual reward by walking the Camino to Compostela, praying before the shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne, or venerating the veil of the Virgin in Chartres. Western Europe was effectively reconsecrated, its own soil declared holy through the strategic placement of these imported treasures. This created a network of new holy sites that often held more practical appeal for the average believer than the distant, war-torn Levant. The economic transformation was immediate and staggering. A town on a major pilgrimage route like the Via Francigena to Rome was like a town situated on a medieval internet highway. Money, ideas, and people flowed through it constantly. Inns, stables, and markets sprang up to serve the travelers. Stone bridges were built across rivers, and local rulers guaranteed safe passage, not out of pure charity, but because they taxed the trade that the pilgrims generated. The wealth of entire regions, from the Po Valley in Italy to the Rhineland in Germany, was supercharged by this spiritual tourism. The very landscape was physically altered to accommodate this new geography of faith, with hospices for the sick and new roads carved through mountains. This was the ultimate consequence of the Great Relic Translocation. The center of the Christian world subtly shifted west. The authority of the Pope in Rome was strengthened, as his city became a premier pilgrimage destination filled with the relics of apostles and martyrs. The dream of a unified Christendom, centered not on Jerusalem but on a network of European holy sites, became a tangible reality, held together by the physical presence of these sacred heirlooms. The divine was no longer a distant story from a far-off land. It was a presence you could encounter in the local cathedral, a power grounded in a specific, accessible place that millions could actually reach. This power to sanctify space and redirect human ambition is perhaps the most enduring and visible legacy of the entire Crusader relic trade. The role of these objects is still evolving, moving from physical sites to digital realms and forcing us to reconsider what it means for a place to be truly holy. The future of these sacred heirlooms is not written in stone, but in the careful climate-controlled logs of modern museums. In a world that grows more secular, their primary role is shifting decisively from objects of active veneration to priceless artifacts of a shared human past. The prayers of pilgrims are being replaced by the precise metrics of conservation scientists. The greatest threats are no longer pious thieves, but the slow, invisible decay brought on by humidity, air pollution, and fluctuating temperatures. A medieval reliquary crafted from gold, wood, and gemstones is a conservation nightmare, with each material expanding and contracting at a different rate. The cost of maintaining these treasures is staggering, requiring endowments and public funding that must be justified not on faith alone, but on their value as cultural heritage. This is where a fascinating new field of study comes into play, called object biography. Scholars are no longer content to simply date a relic. They seek to trace its entire social life, from the moment the original wood was carved or the saint was buried, through its discovery, its journey across continents, its role in political treaties, and its final resting place in a museum case. This approach transforms a fragment of the true cross from a singular article of faith into a node in a vast network. It connects to the timber trade of the ancient Levant, the goldsmith guilds of medieval Paris, the banking houses of Venice, and the romantic nationalism of the 19th century. Its power is no longer just spiritual, it is historical. The relic becomes a prism through which we can view 1,000 years of human endeavor. This layered understanding ensures their continued relevance. Even for a non-religious visitor, standing before the crown of thorns in the Louvre is a profound experience. You are not just looking at a twisted circle of reeds. You are looking at the collateral for a medieval king's loan, the prize that built Sainte-Chapelle, a symbol of French identity and a ghost from a looted city. Its ability to connect us to a deep and complex past is its new kind of sanctity, reflecting on their entire journey from a holy land to a global stage, offers a unique perspective on history itself, not as a series of dates, but as a living, breathing story carried in the fragile beauty of things. The true legacy of a relic is written not in its original purpose, but in the layers of meaning it collects along the way. Each golden casket is a palimpsest, an object whose surface has been written upon, erased and rewritten by every hand that held it. A single thorn from the crown of thorns began as a humble part of a plant, was woven into a story of suffering and redemption, became a symbol of imperial power in Constantinople, then a king's ransom, and finally a national treasure in Paris. Its physical form is constant, but its identity is a fluid narrative shaped by faith, greed, politics, and art. This constant reinterpretation is the engine of history itself. We cannot neatly separate the pious knight from the calculating plunderer, the act of devotion from the act of commerce. The same journey that sanctified a European cathedral often began with the desecration of an Eastern church, forcing us to hold two contradictory truths in our minds at once. These objects are the ultimate survivors, enduring not because their authenticity was ever proven, but because their symbolic power was endlessly renewable. They served the needs of emperors seeking legitimacy, monks seeking solace, towns seeking wealth, and now, museums seeking to understand the human story. Their winding paths across continents reveal a profound and often uncomfortable interconnectedness. The very idea of a purely Western or Eastern cultural heritage collapses under their weight. A reliquary in Germany is built with Byzantine goldsmith techniques to house a bone from a saint who lived in the Middle East, creating a single object that is a fusion of three distinct worlds. These heirlooms force us to see history not as a series of isolated events, but as a continuous, messy conversation between cultures, often conducted through the silent language of things. The enduring human desire they embody is for a bridge to the transcendent, a way to make the intangible divine feel real to the touch. This craving for physical connection is a universal constant, whether it is expressed through a medieval pilgrim kissing a reliquary or a modern tourist feeling awe before the same object in a climate-controlled case. The medium changes, but the fundamental human impulse remains. As we look back on their thousand-year journey, these sacred heirlooms stand as the most eloquent witnesses to our past. They do not just represent history, they have lived it. They have been touched by the prayers of millions, weighed in the balances of kings, and scrutinized by the microscopes of scientists. They have been fought over, bought, sold, stolen, and venerated. In their silent, enduring presence, they contain the entire epic of human ambition, our profound capacity for both creation and destruction, and our timeless search for meaning in a material world. Their journey reveals a powerful truth about history itself. The lineage of these sacred heirlooms is not a straight line from a holy land to a museum case. It is a deep and winding river, flowing from the dusty roads of Palestine to the digital archives of our own time. We have followed their transformation from objects of pure devotion to spoils of war, from high-stakes diplomatic gifts to subjects of intense scientific inquiry. These relics were never static artifacts frozen in a moment of time. They were and remain dynamic participants in the grand theater of history. Their meanings were never fixed. They were constantly negotiated, debated, stolen, sold, and lovingly reinvented by every generation that encountered them. A splinter of the true cross meant one thing to a knight on the walls of Jerusalem, something entirely different to a Renaissance scholar questioning its origin, and something new again to a modern tourist viewing its golden reliquary. This constant reinterpretation reminds us that our understanding of the past is never a perfect reflection of what happened. It is always a conversation, filtered through the values, the fears, and the burning questions of our own present moment. The enduring fascination with these objects lies precisely in this unique ability. They are bridges. They span the chasm between the tangible material world and the intangible realm of the spirit. They connect a specific, dateable piece of wood to an eternal story of sacrifice. They link the hard, factual evidence of science with the soft, powerful light of belief. This exploration is more than a look into the past. It is an invitation. Look closer at the objects that fill your own world. The family locket, the worn-out coin, the peculiar building on your street corner. Each one is a vessel carrying layers of human experience, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and uncover its story. What historical artifact holds a particular fascination for you? Share your own discoveries in the comments and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden layers of our shared past.